I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and a professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history and political science at Emory University. At our center, with a very small and effective staff, we have for 15 years assisted students and educators to deepen their knowledge of Israel. If you're interested in subscribing to the information that we've accumulated on our website, just go to the homepage and hit the subscribe button. The title of today's second CIE webinar in this series is Israel's 9/11, Domestic Reactions, Regional Motivations, and International Responses. An in-depth discussion of Hamas's war on Israel, and we're also asking you to look deeper into our resources to learn more about it. We recognize that events are fluid and very dynamic, with very much unexpected twists and turns. Our guests today are three Israelis, so I'll ask each of one at the very beginning to provide me with a very short sentiment or phrase about their feelings about what has happened to Israel, and then we'll move on to an in-depth discussion of three distinct topics. The murderous attack perpetrated by Hamas terrorists against Israelis on October 7th has reverberated across the region, through Europe, and certainly through to the United States, Central and South America. As Israel buried tens of hundreds of its dead, the government formed an emergency war cabinet to shape responses as thousands were mobilized for reserve duty. Within a week, more than 3,000 Palestinians are reported to have died, and something more than 1,400 Israelis and maybe 3,000 wounded. No president of the United States has ever made a visit to Israel in the middle of a war. Secretary of State Kissinger came to the Middle East at the end of the October 1973 war, not to hold someone's hand, but to conduct diplomacy. Not to provide someone with unqualified support, but to unfold the diplomatic process that he and Anwar Sadat and Golda Meir began to unfold. I doubt sincerely that Hamas's interest in attacking Israel was to unfold a diplomatic process. In the last 9 days, Hezbollah in Israel's north has made serious feints toward a more serious encounter with Israel. It hasn't to date. Palestinians on the West Bank engaged in demonstrations, but not massive in numbers. Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have migrated in significant numbers to the Egyptian-Israeli border, but have not yet passed into Sinai. In Syria, 10 days ago, there was a massive explosion at the main Syrian military academy, further shaking Bashar Assad's regime. In Israel, a national unity government was formed with at least 3 key Israelis in key security positions, also acknowledging their mistakes that they personally made as this surprise attack unfolded. Iran is vowing to take action against Israel if it launches a major strike into the Gaza Strip, and Israel is mobilizing its forces. Responses in Europe and the United States on behalf of Israel have been loud and embracing. Palestinian supporters are vocally engaged as well in support of their friends and relatives. A cursory reading of the Arabic newspapers the last couple of days suggests minor to full-throated endorsement of Hamas's carnage. In print, on TV, the social media, there's now a war going on for the hearts and minds of individuals observing what's going on. So let's unpack a lot of things. Professor Meir Litvak of Tel Aviv University, Sarah Feuer, a lecturer at Reichman University, and Amnon Cavari, also from Reichman University, but currently a visiting professor at the University of Michigan. So if I could get each one of you to perhaps provide me with some just quick general impressions, and then we'll move on to the analysis.
I actually slept in, amazingly, on October 7th. I had just gotten back from a few weeks visiting my family in the US and was seriously jet lagged and had taken a sleeping pill the night before and somehow managed to wake up late. I had heard some booms in my sleep, but I thought it was maybe the first storm to come to Tel Aviv this season. Once I woke up and saw my phone had exploded with all this information was unsettling, to say the least. Since then, it has been alternately devastating with occasional moments of, I think, inspiring hopefulness. I think in many ways on that first day, on October 7th, it felt that the Israeli people and the Israeli army were the two sort of most affected parties here. The state, not so much. And in a way, I think since then, that impression has sort of remained in a weird way.
When alarms were sounded and woke us up, my feelings were, I would say, deep sadness. We always say now our heart bleeds. Deep sadness because of the tremendous casualties, the horrible stories of people who were hiding, pleading for help that did not come. And I have to say, what appeared later in the day to be a colossal intelligence failure and an army failure. Horrifying stories of children hiding in places from killers, which reminded many people, myself included, of stories of the Holocaust, where Jewish children were hiding from murderers. This was truly heartbreaking. I agree with Sarah. I have to say, a former student of mine, of which I'm very proud, a doctor, by the way, should mention. Yes, in a sense that Israeli society sprang up to the challenge much earlier than the state. Previous divisions are put aside right now. There's tremendous determination to fight, to defeat Hamas. Although I have to say that what victory over Hamas means is not clear yet.
I was caught up in the US as this is happening. Second, the sentiments that were voiced earlier about the deep sadness, looking at the horrific stories and images, and now the family funeral that we are witnessing, this puts these events in a perspective that is unimaginable to every Israeli, I think to every human being around the world. Actually, from the United States, I can just say a few things, two things that I want to put on the table. One, the extreme support that we are getting from the United States, led by President Biden, who has showed unequivocal support. And then the other thing is what you're watching now on US campuses, the extreme divide that you can see with regards to Israel and different narratives that we're seeing. I think this is something that is hitting us very, very strongly in how to manage this war moving forward.
Let me start with some context and some basis and go to Meir and ask him a little bit about Hamas's ideology, origins, purposes, its anti-Semitic content, its attitudes, and maybe if you can speculate, why now?
Hamas is the arm wing of the Muslim Brotherhood movement that operates in this land since 1946. Hamas was established in 1987 when the Muslim Brothers decided to abandon their previous policy of first killing Muslim society and then confronting Israel, and decided to join the Intifada by establishing a military arm, and fairly quickly they emerged as the most effective Palestinian terrorist organization. Hamas is an Islamic movement and a national movement. It basically frames the conflict in the Middle East as a religious conflict between Islam and Judaism, Muslims and Jews, not Arabs and Israelis, not Palestinians and Israelis, but Muslims and Jews. It is a religious conflict between absolute good and absolute evil, between the party of God and the party of Satan, which is Judaism. Based on this notion, Hamas developed a vicious anti-Semitic ideology, which borrows themes from early Islamic traditions such from the Quran. Jews are liars, deceivers, thieves, killers of the prophets, etc., but also borrows heavily from modern European anti-Semitism, including the adoption of the Protocols of the Death of Zion, adoption of the blood libel against Jews, justifying the Holocaust while denying it, and a host of other modern anti-Semitic ideas. Another important element for Hamas is that it is sanctified the land of Palestine as a holy Muslim land, and therefore Hamas advocated since its establishment to this day that the only way Palestinians should face Israel is through jihad. And most important, Hamas does not only advocate the elimination of Israel, but in its ideology, the elimination of the Jews as a people is essential to bring about, you can say, human redemption, the end of time, the messianic period where the entire humanity will be redeemed. So Hamas has a genocidal anti-Semitism by advocating the extermination of the Jewish people, not only inside Israel, but ideally, eventually, all over the world.
Does Hamas need stimulus from Iran to do what it needs to do?
Not ideological stimulus. Its ideology is original. It's based from Muslim Brothers and then their own addition. What Hamas gets from Iran is logistical support, financial support, military expertise, technology, and money. And you can say also some kind of backing when Iran was been organizing since 2005 what they call the axis of resistance. That is a strategic bloc against the US and against Israel in the Middle East. Hamas was part of this axis. Certainly Hamas probably hoped that Hezbollah would join it once this attack would develop into full-scale war, and Hezbollah would join or not join, depending on Iran's strategic decision. It's up to Iran to decide whether Hezbollah will join or not join the war.
What did Hamas hope to gain by doing something so dramatic as attacking women and children and old people as compared to just what they consider to be every Israeli civilian who's a person in the military? What ratcheted this up?
First of all, I'm not sure that Hamas expected such tremendous success when they began this operation. I think this operation was much more successful beyond their expectations. To our, I would say, tremendous sadness, to our chagrin. I think they wanted two things. One is to actually deal a heavy punishment on Israel. They are our enemy. Hamas regards its raison d'etre as fighting Israel. Hamas is not satisfied in simply ruling the tiny Gaza Strip. Hamas wants to liberate Palestine, wants to take over the leadership of the national movement. This was supposed to deal a blow, but their policy, their ideology is also, I would say, to wage a war of attrition against Israel, to bleed Israel, to bring Israel to its knees. This is one step in what they see as a long-term strategic struggle against Israel, which will not end today, but may take even decades. But eventually they will bleed Israel, will destroy Israel from within, and then bring about an Islamic state in Palestine.
The reaction has been spotted through the Middle East, but basically highly supportive of Hamas. I don't want to generalize, but basically highly supportive. Could you comment a little bit about the impact this has on the region or on other Arab states?
Generally, I think your impression is right, although there were some distinctions in the reactions that certain Arab states made to October 7th. So it fell into a few categories. On one end of the spectrum, just outright full blanketed support of Hamas. Countries like Algeria, Syria, Iran, not terribly surprising. And then you had states kind of take this sort of middle way of either not outright supporting Hamas, but finding a way to nonetheless condemn Israel or kind of indirectly blame Israel for the fact that this had happened. But you did have some countries that came out and were denouncing violence just in general. And here I would just point out that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, two countries that had come to normalization agreements with Israel, they actually did offer fairly strong statements against what Hamas had done specifically. So there was some variation in the reactions. But I think more generally, some of the potential regional implications of what has happened, I might just offer a few. And it's still, of course, fairly early. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious about certainly predictions. But I think one area that got a lot of people's attention initially was this whole question of normalization, whether these moves that most observers thought were underway to try and bring about an agreement between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, whether we were going to see progress on that front. And incidentally, I think this relates to your question to Meir about the timing, perhaps, for why Hamas ratcheted up this. I don't think it was specifically to scuttle necessarily to deal with Saudi Arabia. We know that the planning for this attack well predated any of those talks. But I do think that there might have been a sense in the last few years of a more general momentum toward Israel's integration in the region. And that more generally is, of course, at odds with what Hamas wants. So for now, I think the normalization with Saudi Arabia is, of course, at least frozen, if not dead. Whether it's able to be revived down the road, I think will depend a lot on the outcome of the war, how Israel emerges from it, if Israel is able to really issue a kind of decisive victory, whatever that looks like. Another, I think, implication for the region has to do with the U.S. role here. For a while now, the perception in the region, deserved or not, has been that the U.S. has turned its attention elsewhere. Washington is very preoccupied with China these days. They've wanted to get out of the Middle East. And I think a lot of regional actors are looking now to see what exactly the United States is willing to do when it issues very clear threats to try and deter Iran, Hezbollah, and others. Is it going to actually live up to its word? One more thing that I would just point out in terms of a regional implication, and it's really still a question mark, and that has to do with whether the Palestinian issue will kind of reemerge as a really regionally salient or important issue. I mean, for a while, the consensus anyway, maybe we have to re-examine it, but the consensus was that the Palestinian issue was not really able to mobilize people in the region anymore. People were very preoccupied with their domestic problems. We saw a decade of turmoil, ISIS coming and going, and the Palestinian cause had lost a lot of its regional salience. Whether now this reemerges, we had sort of managed to, I think, decouple a little bit the Palestinian question from, for example, Israel's ability to make peace with states in the region. Now, due to what has been going on this last 10 days, it's a question whether the Palestinian issue will kind of reemerge and take on its kind of more traditional regional importance.
We learned since Egypt signed its treaty with Israel in 1979 that subsequent Arab states, Jordan in 94, and then the UAE and Bahrain in 2020, and then Morocco and Sudan, each of them did so because they had their own national interests at stake. It wasn't ideology anymore that was guiding or promoting or putting everything else on the back burner. What you might be suggesting is that maybe the Palestinian issue could be something that might overtake the interests of, let's say, Saudi Arabia, who has very profound national interests in trying to create a relationship with the United States and therefore through Israel. In other words, I'm wondering if you would say this is temporary, intermediate, long-term, or you just don't want to speculate.
I think anybody who spends any time in the Middle East or studying the Middle East should know better than to speculate about what's going to happen in the Middle East. But I don't really know at this point. It will depend on a few things. One is really the outcome of this war. I think that Arab states today, there's no real love lost for Hamas, at least on the part of most regimes. Most of these regimes do not like the Muslim Brotherhood. They made that very clear in the last decade. They don't want to see really Hamas establish itself as a serious or maintain itself as a serious player. They, on the other hand, are facing, of course, public opinion, which I think, notwithstanding all the progress Israel has made in the region and the various peace agreements, I think public opinion has remained very sympathetic with the Palestinians. And so Arab leaders today are faced with those competing tensions. And how they navigate that is going to depend on the outcome of the war. It will also depend in part on to what extent the Palestinian cause becomes sort of synonymous with the behavior of Hamas on October 7th. I mean, what they did, the ideology has always been there, and Meir knows this better than anybody, but this was ISIS-like, if not worse. And it seems to me that it's a bit of a liability for the Palestinian cause more broadly if it becomes more and more synonymous with ISIS. I can't see that necessarily working in favor of the Palestinians, but it's the Middle East, so who knows?
Amnon, let's focus a little bit on the United States, the United States-Israel relationship. and something that happened unprecedented this week with the president of the United States being so articulate and so unequivocal. What's your sense about the relationship?
So President Biden has indeed showed unprecedented support coming to Israel during wartime. First time ever that this has happened. It is true that he went also to Ukraine, but this is right in the beginning of the war now, coming to Israel, demonstrating strong support, delivering those speeches that are, especially in contrast to the speeches that we are hearing from Israeli leaders. These speeches have been hugging Israelis more than anybody else, showing a level of support that you cannot compare to anything else, but also supplying Israel with military equipment, sending 2 carriers and intervention units to the region, signaling to Hezbollah and Iran not to get involved, saying just don't be involved because we will be on Israel's side. These are strong shows of support. And I think we need to try to understand why this is actually happening. I think, first of all, President Biden, to his credit, has been for a long time a very strong supporter of Israel. And despite some who argued for a long time in Israel that he is not as supportive of Israel, I think he has managed to show that he is. And now in times of war, he shows it even stronger. But also he's concerned that the event can quickly escalate to regional war or beyond that. And the war threatens U.S. attempts that Biden has been leading to create alignment and include Israel and moderate countries in the region. And containing the war to an Israeli-Hamas conflict ensures that this event will not spill outside of that. But this, I think, is only part of the answer to that. I think more importantly is the belief within the Biden administration, but not only the Biden administration, I think it's also within Israel, that the current government in Israel is not clear that it's capable to manage this war and to make sure that it's contained only to the Israeli-Hamas conflict. The level of anger in Israel, for good reason, and the feeling of Israel that this is a just war that legitimizes aggression, coupled with a fanatic government that is eager to demonstrate to Israel that they can manage a war, question the ability of the Israeli war efforts to set goals and to contain this event. The administration is trying to make sure Israel allows humanitarian aid into Gaza. This was immediately declared outcome of the visit that Biden just had in Israel. But you need to read this in contrast to Ben Gvir, who just said that Israel should not allow any humanitarian aid into Gaza. If you want to make sure that Israel has clear objectives and appropriate plan to focus on dismantling Hamas, the Biden administration to some extent believes that it should be involved in a way that is unprecedented. And finally, an event that is the most catastrophic event in Israel's history should not end in only a military victory, and a belief by the Biden administration that this can open a door into a meaningful and lasting arrangement between Israel and Gaza, and perhaps even between Israel and the Palestinian people. But that should be well organized and well managed for that to happen. So the United States has been showing support, but there are plenty of reasons for that. And part of it is also the lack of strong government in Israel.
We're 400 days away from an American election. You followed American democratic politics for a long time. Does something like this have legs in the American Democratic Party from what you've studied? Or is it the kind of blip that others will look at and say, oh, that was just temporary?
Support for Israel has been polarized the last 20 years with a strong support among Republicans and massively declining support among Democrats, both in public opinion and you see it to some extent among still a few members of Congress. I'm hesitant to say that it will have an effect on U.S. elections. It is 400 days away, and I think from what we're seeing is the U.S. Congress is not able to elect its own speaker. There are too many issues on the American public mind and political mind to have this as an issue that will have a strong effect on U.S. elections. We should understand that Israel is in the hearts and minds of many Americans, but as it comes to elections, it is not, especially when it's aligned well with politics today. I don't see that this would have an effect, but I still think that we should be cautious about what is happening. The decline among the American public in support for Israel is alarming, and this is especially among young Americans and Democrats. I think an outcome of that is what you see on campuses today, with very strong demonstrations against Israel right now, 9 days into this war, in support for Palestinian causes. Some of it is ill-informed, and it harms both campuses and an understanding of the events. And we also see within Congress a strengthening cry among Democrats, still limited to a few members of Congress, but a cry among Democrats to take a more balanced position. So we are seeing processes that should alarm Israel, not in the short term, I believe, but in the long term. And this adds to an ongoing process. It will be influenced by how this war unfolds, and the level of casualties that we'll see on the Palestinian side, and what Israel will do with Gaza. Will it invade? Will it stay in Gaza? And of course, what will happen in the north, as my Israeli friends are now experiencing. We're seeing now rockets hitting the center of Israel and north of Israel. This can escalate very quickly, and that will have a major effect that will also lead us as we move forward.
Do Arab states or Arab leaders want to embrace the kind of ideology that Hamas perpetrated? And what's on the agenda for the Palestinian cause in those places where Islamic ideology, particularly, has the power of the day?
I fully agree with Sarah about the gap between Arab leaders and Arab public opinion. Arab public opinion is very hostile to Israel. Arab leaders are not pro-Zionists, but Israel is not on top of the problems. The top of the problems are domestic, radical Islam, Iran, etc. I think quite a few Arab leaders are afraid of a Hamas victory. Hamas victory may embolden Islamic movements in their own territories, in Egypt, in Jordan. In Jordan, we see it right now, and even the Saudis. The Saudis have a problem with a very conservative Wahhabi religious establishment that they cannot ignore, unlike the Emirates, which can ignore public opinion, or their public opinion is enlightened. Saudi Arabia has a very conservative public opinion, and Saudi government cannot ignore its public opinion. This is one thing which we have to remember. Another point we have to remember is that Arab countries accepted peace with Israel, again, not because they all of a sudden became pro-Zionist or pro-Jewish. It is because they accepted the idea that Israel is there to exist for a long period of time. It's a fact, it's a reality. Should, and here I say, God forbid, Hamas comes out as a victor in this conflict, then this whole idea that Israel is there to stay for a long time will be shaken. It may be replaced by another thought that Israel is actually crumbling, that Israel is declining, that the idea of the rise and decline and fall of Israel is realistic. This could then bring about important strategic changes in the region. This is why it is essential for Israel to come out on top in this war, because it's not only the question of us versus Hamas, which is already a major question, but it's us against Hezbollah, it's us against Iran, and also in order to maintain our relations with our countries. And here, by the way, I think we are in the same line with several Arab leaders, although, of course, they would never be able to say publicly.
There's an additional sort of irony, possible irony, that I think we can expect. We've already seen it, the reactions of most regional states. We can expect that as the war continues, there will be mostly statements of solidarity with the Palestinians, with what's happening in Gaza. I don't think that's going to change, but it may be that certain states like Saudi Arabia that appeared at least inclined to be willing to entertain some sort of normalization with Israel, that assuming Israel is able to come out of this on top, states like Saudi Arabia will maybe need to continue to toe the line of the sort of pro-Palestinian concern for Gaza, so that on the other side of this, they will have some maybe credibility in coming in and actually being a little more involved in what happens the day after Hamas. And from Israel's standpoint, I think it is in Israel's interest to see countries like those that already signed normalization agreements with her, countries that may have been open to it. I think it's in Israel's interest to see those countries sort of more involved in the post-war situation than other countries in the region. It's kind of maybe a fantasy at this point, but for the time being, we should expect sort of the normal kinds of statements that we're accustomed to.
we should also be aware that there's no political climate at this point in Israel that can actually accept that. So the fantasy is because of that, right? So the Israeli, not the current government, and I cannot see a viable government after this without elections, definitely, and also with elections, I'm not sure, that can in of itself embrace a solution that will include or satisfy those moderate countries, including Saudi Arabia.
Europeans have so far maintained an attitude of what went on in Gaza was horrendous, was impossible to accept and understand. How long does that stay glued together, even in a very loose fashion?
Again, I think it's going to depend on what the war starts to look like on the ground. I don't want to be overly cynical, but I think Israel going into this has more legitimacy internationally than it has had in previous rounds of what now in retrospect seem almost relatively minor in terms of escalations with Hamas. Israel going into this has more legitimacy, I think, from the West than it did in previous instances. But I think Israel is very aware that even that, it's on a clock. There will likely come a point where the statements will maybe lessen in terms of their tenor of full-throated support. Israel is expecting that there will be a shift at some point. I don't know when that will occur, and it may be that Israel has a little bit more time than what it might have otherwise had the attack on October 7th not just been so horrific.
Stepping back a ways, 50 years, was the key turning point for the Middle East, the overthrow of the Shah and the unfolding of the Khomeini regime, and that ability to spread what came to be a foreign policy, and a toxic foreign policy, was that a shift, a turning point, a benchmark? What would you say if you take a look at Middle Eastern history over the last, 50 or 100 years?
Well, 1979 was a unique year because there were three major events which influenced our lives today. One was the Iran Revolution, one was the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement, and one was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which then led to the birth of Al-Qaeda, which eventually led to the birth of ISIS. And it shows you that in the same year, the Middle East took two opposing ways or paths. Egypt opting, let's say, for peace, reconstruction, economic development, etc. Iran, what later in Afghanistan, radicalism, aggressive foreign policy, and so on. In a way, this is one event. Now, with the Arab world as a whole, the Arab world has been in crisis for the past 200 years. This crisis continued and exacerbated, in fact, in the last 10 years, with what so-called Arab Spring, which ended in failure and bloodshed. So the continuous crisis of the Arab world continues. It has not been solved, and it will be extremely difficult, if at all, to solve it, which ironically, to some extent, helped Israel because it made Israel more stable, stronger, or looks more stable, stronger, more prosperous, and even, by the way, some sort of envy amongst Arab countries. At the same time, radical Islam reached heights of power, influence, but also suffered blows in so-called Arab Spring. This is why the current war is so important. Again, radical Islam should not be allowed to win, not only for us, but for the Arab countries. Iran also, by the way, faces many problems, domestic problems, etc. Success for Iran is not good, not only for Israel, but also for Arab countries. Iran's success or failure does not depend so much on the outcome of this war, but is an important factor. But certainly, this war, again, has, I think, major repercussions for the entire Middle East. I hope it will not be a turning point for the re-emergence of radicalism and so on. Again, here a lot depends on the outcome of the war.
And one thing we know for certain, if you have oil and you can produce it, you can gain dollars. And if you have dollars, you can do what you want with it, for good and for bad. And as long as there's oil in the geology of the Middle East, it has an impact on the geopolitics. And I think that's not going to go away.
Yes, although Arab countries squandered trillions of their oil money, Iran is also, in a way, squandering its oil wealth for other.
What would each one of you want to be the best possible outcome of where we are in the middle of this Hamas-Israel war?
the best possible outcome would be that Israel is able to do what it needs to do in order for there not to be, there will be Hamas supporters in Gaza. There will be members of Hamas walking around, and the ideas certainly aren't going anywhere. That should go without saying. But that Hamas will no longer be in a position to be able to launch rockets to really pose any kind of security threat to the state. And at the same time, that soon enough, Israel is in a position to be able to hand off, at least partially, most of the governance for Gaza to some combination of either an international presence, some involvement of the friendlier Arab states. I don't think that Israel should be inviting players like Qatar and others to come in and be a part of the kind of rebuilding of Gaza. So in my kind of ideal scenario, Hamas is no longer a political player there. And you have at least an interim arrangement where a combination of international donors and regional states that also have an interest in not seeing Hamas reemerge are on the ground there.
I would echo Sarah's view. I would try to think even, I know it seems implausible at this point, but to try to take this eventually, not now, but eventually as an opportunity not only to rebuild Gaza, but also to rebuild a relationship or to re-engage a process in which we were able to work together with the Palestinians. The fact that we've been allowing Hamas to strengthen over the last 20 years or so has reached the situation we are in now. And we should try the best we can to make sure that the new institutions that are involved there are going to be ones that we can work with and engage with. So
basically, I agree with Sarah. I would just add that in addition to breaking the military power of Hamas, that is, that Hamas will no longer be a military player, we have to bring in the Palestinian Authority back to Gaza in some way. Now, it cannot be done alone. It will have to be done with some help and support of Arab states, but it's essential to bring back the Palestinian Authority, as problematic as it is. Mahmoud Abbas is not my dream partner, considering some of his statements, but he's the lesser evil. And we have to bring the Palestinian Authority back, and yes, somehow to transform Gaza from a den of terrorism into simply viable. It will be poor, it will also be miserable, but entity that somehow will be viable, and so somehow we can coexist with it.
Dr. Feuer, Dr. Litvak, Dr. Cavari, Sarah, Meir, Amnon, thank you for joining us and for edifying us today and our audience. We hope we can call upon you again in the not too distant future. This is the second of a series of webinars on the topic of Israel at war with Hamas. We will convene again next week on Wednesday at noon, 7 p.m. Israel time. If you like what you saw, or you like what you heard, or you like what you read on our website, please consider making a contribution to our work. We would greatly, greatly appreciate it. And if you want to subscribe to any of the items which we provide for free, just go to the homepage and hit the subscribe button.